Bonnie has asked me to say that all the music that you're hearing today and all the poetry was selected by David for this occasion. I'm going to read number 479 by Emily Dickenson. It's in your program. It's the first poem, if you would like to read one. Number 479. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.
The loss of David is hard for all of us. I wouldn't say it's any harder for me, but perhaps more poignant, because I realized that until he died, David was the person who had known me the longest all my life, just a week short of 70 years. How do you sum up the life of a sibling? I don't think you can, because so much varied experience has gone into that life. Some things stayed the same, but so much more changed. So I'll merely record some things I know, some things I remember, and some feelings I'm left with. David was born in New York City, July 22nd, 1947. He was the son of two Midwesterners, Ruth Brody of Des Moines, Iowa, and John Corcoran of Chicago, who met and by all indications fell in love at the University of Chicago. On Ruth's side was a rabbi, and on John's a Catholic priest. Both sets of parents are reported to have been dubious about the match, but I think, at least in David's case, it turned out to be a good combination. Despite those parental doubts, they married. John went off to war, an officer in command of a platoon of war correspondents in North Africa. Ruth lived in New York, working at Encyclopedia Britannica. Soon after the end of the war, David was born, and then within 2 years, our father was killed a few miles south of here in a solo car crash. Later, David wrote a poem about that crash, which he wanted read today, and I'll read at the end of these brief remarks. At the time of our father's death, I, David's little brother, was just a couple of months in the womb. David was fairly curious about our family history, but especially about our father, and over the years he spoke to a number of people who had known our father to try to discover what he was like. But in the end, I think David was unsatisfied, because really what he wanted to know was what our father was like, or would have been like, with David, and that was something unknowable. In 1953, when David was 6, Ruth married Bill DIEBOLD, and the three of us moved from Piermont to Bill's house on North Broadway in Upper Nyack. where, along with Bill's 3 kids, and in time William, I'd say we had a pretty happy childhood. David was brainy from the start, a super student who graduated at the top, and I mean actual valedictorian of his elementary, junior high, and high school class. And he managed to do that without getting a swelled head. David didn't make waves or cause trouble. That role was adequately filled by me. Later, David talked to me about his sense of himself as a boy, perhaps even with regret, saying that he had wanted and needed everything to be all right, and that his role in that was to be as perfect as possible. He had a powerful memory from when he was a little boy at 3 or 4, and had had to be hospitalized with a dangerous bone infection. At that time, visiting hours, even for parents, was short and rigorously enforced. And David told me that he suffered terrible fear and loneliness between the times that our mother was allowed to be with him. So, he told me, he developed this feeling, be good and do well, and everything will be all right. Our childhood, skipping flat stones on the river, ball games, croquet, long family dinners with very lively discussion, books, music, more books, Christian holidays, but Jewish ones were given equal time. For years, David played incessantly a baseball game called APBA, which involved dice and large poster board cards and actual player statistics. It was possible to play an entire season with all 16 teams, National and American leagues, 152 games. Each team, I think it took months, and David did it at least once. Walk by his door and you'd see him at his desk, classical music playing in the background, pencil in hand, throwing the 3 dice, flipping the cards, and making notations. When David was about 15 or 16, for Christmas or his birthday, I can't remember which, he asked to be given a calculator. You know, the kind that banks give away when you'd open an account. Except then, they had just come out, sort of a miracle innovation. And I remember clearly it cost $100, which was a lot of money back then. I think if it had been any of us other kids, our parents would have asked, do you really want a calculator? But in David's case, it was, he needs this. David held his first job in journalism at 16, reporting on local sports at the Journal News in Nyack. I used to watch him head into town on afternoons after school, walking with his signature stride, bouncing on the balls of his feet. There were friends, I think it was Edward Leahy and he, who in high school invented their own language, Bubbit. Maybe Bubbit was an invented country too, I can't remember. The language was a sort of pidgin English, and you'd hear them speaking it between themselves in David's room. Let me get a little sip of water. I have to report that, as brothers will, David and I fought. Actually, we fought a lot. We both bore the scars and chipped teeth to prove it. It got so bad that when we were in our early teens on our annual summer visits to our grandparents, one set in Des Moines, the other in Chicago, which were actually a lot of fun for us, we were separated. The grandparents just couldn't take the squabbling. David would be sent to Des Moines, and I to Chicago. 2 weeks later, we would switch. There were girlfriends. Many years later, when I was in Vermont, I ran into a woman who, it turned out, had gone to Nyack High with David. Oh my God, she said, I had such a crush on your brother. Also, I think I remember a certain tall, blonde young woman at one point, maybe the summer after graduation. I'm not sure what happened back then, but I know David never forgot her, and many years later, he and Bonnie reconnected and ultimately married. Which is certainly not to take light away from Susan and CAREY and the children from those marriages. Thomas with Susan, and Kat and Daniel with CAREY. No doubt, David could have gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton if he wanted, but he chose Amherst, certainly not a second-tier college. I think because he was ready to relax somewhat in the academic realm. And he certainly did well there, but David did well everywhere he went. After Amherst, David taught English at Rockland Country Day School for a year, then took a job at the Bergen Record, working there for over 15 years. When the opportunity came for a position at the New York Times, he took it, even though he was accepting a lower salary than he was making at the record. We'll hear more about his illustrious career at both papers from others today. It was always great to visit David at the Times. I remember one time especially when I brought an aspiring journalist, the 23-year-old daughter of a friend, she's also my goddaughter, to meet David. I was touched by her aplomb, but more by David's interest in her. His taking the time to sit down with her, ask perceptive questions, and ultimately encourage her in her aspirations. Then he took us upstairs to the incredible New York Times cafeteria and bought us lunch, which we ate while he pointed out various Times luminaries. That young woman now lives in London and has a job writing news and background under her own byline at CNN. We all knew David's wit, his grin, and the light in his eyes when he was about to say something funny, or to imitate the voice of one baseball broadcaster or another, often one from the 1950s or 60s. Then, of course, there were poems. It was certainly wonderful for me to see David round out his life to acknowledge and realize his creative and emotional depths through poetry. And I think many of us will agree, fine poetry indeed. David and I stopped fighting and started talking. Gradually, the adult in us took ascendancy, and we put away our childish rivalries. And there was a lot to talk about. In the last year of David's life, we talked sometimes every day, and we became closer than we'd ever been before. In all of that year, I never heard David complain once. He took things as they came and faced them with resolution and an attitude of, okay, what do we do next? He was certainly aware that his disease might kill him. And during one conversation, somehow I felt emboldened enough to ask him how he perceived that possibility. He said, "I'm not afraid, but I hate the idea of missing out on being with all of you." So here's the poem David wrote after finding and visiting the site of our father's crash. Here, underneath all this, underneath the broken branches, pale twigs, blown leaves, rotting acorns, gray mud alive with colonies of beetles, millipedes, spiderlings, larvae in all their tiny shapes and sizes, above the brittle sandstone crust that holds all this up is the accident's imperceptible scour. That night, 50 years ago, the car spun off the highway, pirouetting, I imagine, gracefully, swaying and toppling as it cleared the guardrail, scattering squirrels and ground birds, the door opening in mid-flight, and pitching him out, the belly of the roof coming to rest on him. The night was cold. Twigs and bits of snow dug into his bare neck, and as rescuers strained to lift the car away, he lay there, wishing he could help, and saw the last things he saw. Blue-black sky, pinpoint stars, night pines, tall oaks.
Well, good morning, everyone. And my name is Thomas. I'm David's eldest son. I think he just told you that. I'd like to thank everybody here for being here. This means the world to me, and I know it would have meant the world to my father. He spoke a lot over the last year and some change about how absolutely surprised he was to find all of the people who were coming out of the woodwork and lending their support, giving him hope, and I mean, he was absolutely confounded by it. He didn't quite understand that how much of an impact he had on all of our lives. I have no prepared remarks. I just thought I'd do what I can here. So, I wanted to refer to the poem that my Uncle John just read, because it's been something I've been aware of all my life, that he lost his father before he would ever even have a memory of the man, and that he was searching out, reaching out in his mind to try to picture what that would be like. I think, some of that made him absolutely terrified to become a father. So when he was confronted with the reality of me coming along, he was, naturally nervous. As my Uncle John said, he said so many things that, in the exact words that I would say them, and I'm sure many more will. But he always, tried to do the right thing, and that's what he did by me. Our relationship at times could be summed up in 5 words we all generally understand, sometimes between fathers and sons. But in the song, I mean, he gave so much of himself, and the balance, I can't. He was a great father, is what I'm trying to say. An absolutely wonderful father, forgiving, understanding, supportive, nurturing, and I've been missing him a lot, and I don't have to wonder, though, in the future what things would be like, because I've realized that all I need to do is look within myself, look to my siblings, look to my extended family, and he's there. He's right here. I'm looking at it. I'm feeling it. He is here and will remain, and the ripples of what he has done will echo on. And I thank him, and I thank all of you.
Hi. For those of you who have never met me before, my name is David Corcoran, and I really wanted to thank everybody for coming here to pay respect to a wonderful person. And I'm just so grateful that I had the time I did. I would call him practically every day to tell him how much I love him, and I really am just so glad that he's been there for me through so many things, and he really helped to introduce me to where I am today, including where I live. So I wanted to thank him for being such a great father. So I'll see you again someday, David Corcoran, my wonderful father, and I love you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's so good to see everybody here to pay respect to my father. I wish I were seeing you all under better circumstances. I know we don't get to see each other enough. Most of you know me. I'm David's daughter, Kat. When my father was first diagnosed with leukemia, one of my coworkers recommended that I go tell him anything that I needed to tell him, settle out any conflicts, and without hesitation, I told her that I didn't have any. And I've had almost a year to come up with something, and I really haven't. you know, we had our occasional arguments, but for the most part, I felt like we were always very much on the same page. I feel so lucky to have had the relationship that I did with my father. How many people can say that? When I was growing up, my dad worked in the city and he got home fairly late at night, so we didn't see him that much during the week, but he would often make us breakfast and drive us to school. And then on the weekend, he was a very involved parent. I have a lot of very fond memories of day trips to museums, galleries, parks, plays, hikes. He really liked to tell us stories that he made up on the spot for us. And as we grew, these became kind of more collaborative stories. My story involved a bird with rainbow wings carrying me away as a toddler. But we all had our storylines. I know most of you know that he was a talented poet, writer, and editor, but most of you probably never got to experience his fiction. But it was truly a special experience. I remember on at least one occasion the power went out and we sat together in the living room as a family and collaboratively made up a story about going on a trip to Australia, and we weren't bored at all. As I got older, we went on roller coasters together. We developed a shared love of graphic novels, which we traded back and forth for birthdays and holidays. I brought him to his first ska show. Not exactly his thing, but I appreciated that he always kept it in mind. He began doing restaurant reviews when I was 10 or 11, and I gradually transitioned from a picky eater into the foodie that I identify as now. For the past 10 or so years, as I've become an adult, our relationship has been characterized by mutual respect and adoration. We've both been very busy that whole time. You know, as a lot of you know, David retired and then went out of retirement and wrote a book, and he keeps busy as well. So our phone calls and visits were always, you know, too short and far between, but we made up for lack of quantity with quality. We both moved several times, and we loved bringing each other to our new favorite restaurants, galleries, museums, shows. We discussed everything: politics, books, genealogy, our plans for the future. He was always so respectful and supportive of my choices and opinions. I was trying to think of anecdotes, advice that he'd given me. I don't think he really gave me advice. But in not giving me advice, I feel like he taught me to ask questions about everything and think through everything, and in some ways that's been so much more helpful to me than having a parent tell you what you should think or what you should do. That wasn't who he was. For as long as I could remember, I've always felt like we just got each other. We were, you know, kind of two peas in a pod. When he and my mother separated, I remember not really being upset about the separation or the divorce. I was just worried that he wouldn't be happy, and I just wanted him to be happy so badly. And then when I saw him with Bonnie for these last several years, it's been incredible, and I'm so sad that they didn't get more time together. One thing that really struck me after his death was the number of people who reached out to share stories of the impact that he had on them. I also, as Thomas said, it just seemed so incredulous that all of these people were turning out in support of him when he had cancer, which wasn't surprising to me. He's this incredible guy, but yet I had a similar surprise as you know, people who I hadn't heard from in many years reached out to me, sending me messages about the impact that he had on them. A friend from kindergarten who subsequently moved, who I hadn't spoken to in 25 years, sent me a message saying that she clearly remembered his kindness, his pleasant, gentle way of speaking, and his brilliance. Friends from college recounted how excited he was to give them tours of the New York Times building, and some acquaintances from college who I otherwise hadn't been in touch with reached out to tell me what a captivating and interesting speaker he was when he came to give a guest lecture on journalism. I think it really speaks to what an incredible person my dad was, that these very brief interactions could leave such a lasting impression. I inherited many things from my dad: my sense of humor, my ability to retain tons of frequently useless facts. We would have been an excellent trivia team because I knew like the science medicine aspect of things and he knew like the history culture aspect of things. Unfortunately, we never really got to play that one out, but my poor gross motor skills and my passion for learning. I'm very grateful to have these reminders of him to carry with me. And I feel like along with our memories, these are the things that keep him alive within us. On July 22nd, 2019, just under 2 weeks before he died, my father turned 72 years old. He was still enrolled in a clinical trial in Colorado at that point, although we knew that the chance that he would recover was low. I called him that morning to say happy birthday and to let him know that my housemate's baby Rowan, who I'm co-parenting, had been born overnight. His birthday is also shared with his stepsister Barbara Wick, who we lost several years ago. My father has embraced my non-traditional chosen family and was very excited to hear about the arrival of a new baby. Suffice it to say that Rowan has big shoes to fill, taking over that birthday. I feel very privileged to have been raised by this kind, gentle, accepting, open, brilliant man, and I really hope that I'm able to continue to carry his characteristics with me. That's all I got. I think he would be so happy to see you all here for him today and to hear everything that everyone has had to say about him. He was truly a special man and he's touched a lot of lives. Thank you.
I'm William DIEBOLD, one of David's brothers. And I know that there are a lot of journalists in the room. And as a tribute to David's repertorial and editorial scrupulousness, I wanted to offer a potential correction to a news item you saw earlier. I think better late than never. Much of the material published here seems unimpeachable. The caption gives the correct names and ages for David and John and accurately reports their Piermont, New York hometown. I was not yet born when the events described here allegedly took place, but I know that we did with some frequency travel to visit our grandmother, our mother's mother, who did indeed live in Des Moines, Iowa. The maraca and the toy pushcart referred to in the caption are there for all to see. The likelihood that they were indeed used for amusement on the flight seems high, especially given David's proud display of his instrument. So much seems indisputable. What is in dispute is the last line. The youngsters made this trip alone. As I say, I was not there. But in separate interviews with me, admittedly much after the fact, both David and John vigorously disputed that our mother would have sanctioned the two of them, one a 2-year-old, flying halfway across the country by themselves. Such a trip is certainly outside today's societal norms, and it must also have been in 1951 or 1952 when this story appeared. But I think that disapproval must be what is being expressed by those portentous ellipsis points after the headline, "They flew through the air." I can't otherwise explain them myself. So David and John view this story as a calumny. As for myself, I can't be so sure. Our mother believed in independence and had a spirit of adventure, especially when it came to travel. And she surely could have used some help with David and John. We are, after all, dealing with a widowed mother raising 2 very small children. In the end, though, it's that maraca that makes me think that David and John are probably right, that this is a piece of sensationalist fake news. One thing my mother certainly exhibited was respect for her neighbors. And that and her general savvy as a parent make me pretty sure that she never allowed an unaccompanied maraca on a long plane flight. Although given what John has said about David's attempt to make everything right. Maybe he was the 40-year-old who never shook that maraca. All of those characteristics of our mother, adventure, self-reliance, respect for others, come through in just the brief first stanza of David's poem about her that I'm about to read. And in reading and rereading this poem in preparation for today, I've really come to admire it as both a character study and as a poem. And I have to say that, like Kat, I generally have few regrets about my relationship with my brother, but I do very much regret that I didn't express my admiration for him as a poet and for this poem more and more often when I had the chance. So this is a poem by David called To Ruth. You studied Italian for this trip, pumping through the phrase book. Mi scusi for attention or apology, permesso when squeezing past someone. The R is Midwestern. You'd sooner shed your top at a nude beach than roll an R. Then cancer, as efficient as you were. Fa bel tempo in Chianti this morning. Warm breeze stirring the silvery olive leaves. Last night we heard raspy breaths under our window, a wild boar snuffling in the moonlight. You'd have laughed and translated, Il cinghiale respira.
I also want to add my thanks to everyone who is here to pay tribute to our David. I met David Corcoran in the 1970s when we were colleagues at the Bergen Record newspaper. In 1980, when David came to our home to pay a condolence call after my late husband, Marvin OLICK, died, he met my daughter, CAREY. They were married in 1983. As CAREY said recently, not many people get to introduce their daughter to their future son-in-law. And the title mother-in-law doesn't always conjure up the best images. But my relationship with David would defy any bad stereotypes. David was my dear good friend, and remained so after he and CAREY separated. He was always a cherished part of our large extended family, which included the children and grandchildren of my late husband, Larry Rubin. When David moved to Cambridge to work at MIT, he bonded closely with the 3 of my 4 children who live in the Boston area. They socialized, visiting each other, and always keeping in touch. All of my children and many of my grandchildren are here today, including a 5-week-old great-grandchild. Thank you to the Boston contingent for making the trip. Because of time constraints, I'm going to leave it to others to extol David's remarkable virtues as a writer, editor, and poet. But I do want to talk about his part-time gig doing restaurant reviews for the New Jersey section of the Sunday New York Times. I'm sure David inherited his discerning palate and culinary skills from his mother, Ruth, who was a member of the James Beard Foundation. She was an excellent cook and wrote byline cookbook reviews for the Library Journal. And thanks to David, she became a good friend. Anyway, David's routine as a reviewer was to invite another couple to join him and CAREY at the chosen restaurant. The only stipulation was that each participant had to order something different so David could sample an array of food. As my buddy Gary Stein said, David would take one taste of my main dish and know more about its ingredients than I would after eating the whole thing. David wrote more than 250 reviews of New Jersey restaurants. When I asked him why he stopped doing it, he said, after all this time, the vocabulary bin for restaurant reviews was just about empty. David's banter was never banal. He was great at remembering my birthday. After he and Carrie divorced, he called her to ask if it would be all right for him to invite me out for lunch on my birthday. Now, how is that for etiquette? One year he gave me a book, City Room, personally inscribed by the author, Arthur Gell, who had then recently retired as the managing editor of the New York Times. The inscription read, "To Alice, with admiration to a crusading journalist and with warmest wishes, Arthur Gelb, 7/20/04. Since I had never met Mr. Gelb, I could only assume that my son-in-law had been singing my praises. That's when I told David that I wanted him to write my obituary. Never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined that I would be here as a part of his. I first met Bonnie a few years ago at my granddaughter Kat's graduation from medical school in Chicago. I was impressed with how Bonnie and David and Carrie and her guy Paul interacted with each other and with Gary and me. It was a joyful occasion, and we were all celebrating it happily together. Carrie told me recently that she was touched when David, planning a visit to this past April to this area, asked if he could stay with her and Paul. Gary and I were invited to have brunch there with him. Carrie now says, I think he came to say goodbye. It was the last time I saw David. I am ever grateful for having had such a fine, thoughtful, kind, caring, intelligent, and talented son-in-law. I want to thank Bonnie for giving me an opportunity to speak here today. I truly hope that we can stay in touch and be friends. I believe David would wholeheartedly approve. And I think I speak for everyone here when I say, David, we were lucky to have you for as long as we had you. Thank you for being you, David.
Well, everyone else, but the slideshow with the piano, I almost went down for good, except for one thing, the mustache. My name is Ben Carey, Benedict Carey. I'm a reporter at the New York Times in the science section. David Corcoran was my colleague, my editor, and my friend, roughly in that order. I'm going to say a few things about each of those roles. I got the New York Times in 2004. David had been there a long time, had been in the science section there. He was a fixture, and I think David liked being a fixture. He was an unflappable and gracious and humorous colleague, of course. His spirit has come through in the comments of others. He was also what I consider the master of the small, silly act. And so David could imitate colleagues, including one whose very nasal voice will go unnamed. He's not here, is he? And he would say something like,
that looks like smart aggregation.
And then they sort of insert these things anytime the conversation came to a halt. Sometimes he'd sing in that mock voice.
What kind of fool am I?
Again, dropping it randomly into places where humor was needed. And of course he had his big baseball book, which he read from sometimes also at random, to say, Ben, did you know Andy Echeverria, his best year for the Orioles was 1956. Look, 12 triples. He also had this running prank with John Schwartz, and John may be here, where they were sending this stick-em note to each other over years. And so, you know, one of them would open a drawer, and there it was, planted by the other one. And I know at least on one occasion, John was called out of a news conference at like the Kennedy set at the Cape Canaveral or something because he had an urgent package. There was the sticky note. David was a deft editor. He didn't get in his own way or make work for himself at all. He didn't put himself into your copy. Very much a wordsmith. And he had the voice, the fingers of the New York Times. So he could take a story that seemed somehow soft and uncertain, just move a few things around, put a little phrase in there, and then, oh my God, now it had shoulders. It felt like the New York Times story. It had some authority. He'd say, how the hell did you do that? And he wouldn't touch very much. He was so deft, in fact, that one time, one of my stories, he switched a couple of experts. Only he moved the experts, but not the quotes. So that expert A was saying heatedly that psychiatric drugs were terrible, and expert B was heatedly defending them, only vice versa. But it won't surprise you that, this being the New York Times, I heard immediately from both of those experts who were appalled. Appalled. They thought that professionals worked at the New York Times. They thought at least one professional worked at the Times. So I walked over to David's desk and I said, David, you did a terrific job editing this story. And I saw the fear in his eyes immediately. He was ashamed and embarrassed, as he always was, anytime he screwed up, because he cared. And to settle us both down, he pulled another act, a Corcoran act, of the kind that I read before, which is that he wrote a mock correction. It was a correction buff. He liked to read them out loud, especially when they were impossible to understand. And he wrote this mock correction, which deeply insulted both the experts and the New York Times. and so it was my mission to try to find this correction. And I couldn't. And I'm sorry about that. But in looking for it, I was rewarded. Because David would send, we were friends now. This is part 3. We were now exchanging all kinds of notes and funny things. And he sent me this with no comment. He sent it by email. And I just have to read it because it captures so much of David. First of all, it's about baseball. And it's about baseball in New York, in the New York that David had in his heart, which is the one he grew up with the big bumper cars with big bumpers in the summertime and ballparks and all of that. It's about Roy Campanella, and Roy Campanella is a baseball player. Most of you know that he's the second to break the color barrier after Jackie Robinson, who was a catcher here for the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Brooks. As follows, from David Corcoran by email. Quote, Roy Campanella, whose impish, pudgy hand grins at you from the cover of a current magazine noted for its jinxing powers, today hammered the hex into the left field bleachers with 2 down and 2 on in the 9th to give the Brooks an 11-10 tingler. That was it. I asked him, is the 11-10 tingler a sex toy? And he said, I think so. So he'll be remembered in many ways by many people, but I think it wouldn't completely put him off to be known also as an 11-10 tingler.
Hey Bonnie, hello everyone. David and I didn't plan it this way, but it turns out that neither of us could be here in person today. It's especially irritating that David isn't here, because he would have come up with far better commentary than I've done. He was a better thinker and a better writer than almost anyone I knew who had fallen prey to daily journalism. It was a vocation he adored, especially at the Times, which he also adored and where, on the best of days, and there were so many of them, he helped create magic in print. David and I first met at the close of 1971 when I joined the record. He was 24, I was 23. We ended up in a 5-member team covering a part of the circulation area known as Northern Valley, mostly wealthy suburbs where nothing much was supposed to happen and where usually nothing much did. 4 of us wrote prosaic stories about zoning board meetings, but where we saw bland landscapes of bland people on 1-acre lots, David saw a society as complex as a beehive, worthy of rich, detailed narratives, sprinkled with universal truths, great quotes, and a few hidden zingers. How could he do that? What did he know about zoning that the rest of us didn't? And yet, David would say that daily reporting and writing was torture for him. It was hard to believe because what he produced was pure gold, and that's because everything he wrote contained the 2 W's they don't teach in journalism school: wit and wisdom. When he went on to write editorials and oversee the editorial page of the record, a perch that was a journalism prize in those days, he examined news and culture as closely as Thoreau examined Walden. Years later, watching David immerse himself in poetry, which grew into a magnificent obsession, it seemed to me that he had finally figured out what he was meant to be. In fact, what he had been all along: a philosopher. Having a philosopher for a friend has enormous advantages. Really good philosophers like David could explain why otherwise normal people would want to root for the Mets. He could engage deeply on politics, science, the human condition, and the lyrics in Tom Leira's vast musical library. He could share thoughts on love and loss and pain and friendship, an openness not practiced by many men. And he could analyze a great meal or recommend a good psychiatrist. He even understood loyalty. I think he even understood me. David was a 21st century fellow who would have been comfortable in earlier decades. On most days, he was a cross between E.B. White, Clifton Fadiman, and Fred Allen, a kind of public intellectual who concealed a wicked sense of humor. Starting last summer, when David and Bonnie moved into their home in Corrales, David suggested that we might schedule a weekly phone call, and we did. His goal was to keep in touch with his ancestral land, the East Coast, and I think maintain a direct line to someone with a kind of institutional memory of his adult life, a goal I shared. At first we just bantered. Eventually we'd start off talking about his precarious health, but then moved back to anything and everything, and David was a good talker, but he was also a world-class listener, an active listener, able to shut out the background noise and steer the conversation to just the right place. Which is why today I never expected to be here, on tape anyway, 2 months after David's death. Because quite honestly, despite the evident facts of his medical condition when I left him in August, I kind of expected to be flying back to New Mexico in a few weeks to continue our conversation. We both knew better. But when your friend is a Mets fan, it's hard to believe there won't be a next time. Thanks for listening.
Hey, you guys, I'll try to hold it together, but I'm sure you'll all bear with me. I'm Bonnie, David's wife. So I spent a lot of time trying to think of what would be the most important thing I could say here to all of you in the near end of this memorial. I could tell you what a joy it was to live with David. How when we walked together, he'd tuck my right arm up under his left, pulling me in and singing to me. How he would always call me sweetheart, baby, beautiful. How he would greet me when I came home at night with a wide wingspan of a hug. Keep the house supplied with flowers and laughter and filled with beautiful music. Bach, Haydn. I could just focus on how this man who lived so fully in the now was also beautifully connected to the past. How we sat in a bar high above Manhattan, and he told me detailed stories of the history of the buildings we were looking down on. How, as we wandered the streets of Nyack, he pointed out who lived where. Not just when he was a boy growing up, but in the years and decades before he was born. How every day he carried several old coins, a 1945 Walking Liberty $50, a 1900 5-cent piece, in his pocket, so that every time he needed change, he'd have to take the entire handful out and sort through it carefully so that he didn't spend the precious old coins. He was just connected that way. And of course, how he could sing all 20+ verses of Anything Goes, and would do so often, invited or not, always slightly out of tune, and always with great enthusiasm. But then I found several notebooks of things he wrote in the last year, and I thought, I'll let David speak for himself. Hold on one second. He was such an acute and poetic observer of his illness and his own reactions to it, and what came through over and over and over through the setbacks and the fear and the details of this awful disease was how happy he was, how much my love and your love kept him going. And I mean that. It really helped him. Here's what he wrote. I'm looking at death a lot. It's more about sadness for Bonnie and the kids, plus everyone else. Anxiousness that they'll be overwhelmed with stuff I've left unattended. That's the considerate part of him. He didn't leave anything unattended. But also regret that I won't be around to enjoy married life, retired life with Bonnie. We've had a beautiful run. It's made me happier than I ever knew I could be. I don't want it to end. But then I think, well, it hasn't ended, and it probably won't end today or tomorrow or the next day. And meanwhile, there's laughter and snuggling and long looping conversations that are the most relaxed I've ever had. And he said this. Over lunch, after a Mother's Day walk through Lonnie Cheeseman Park, we tallied the pluses and minuses of my AML. Minuses, medical obstacle course, bolt from the blue setbacks, not to mention the non-trivial prospect of early death. Pluses, the support network, its wide reach and heartfelt depth, the heightened enjoyment of life, the happiness, so much clearer and stronger than ever. I really think we keep each other going and happy despite the leukemia angst. This may yet kill me, but I'll die lucky, damn it. And finally, on the last night he was conscious, he awoke at 2:30 in the morning, aware that we were basically awaiting his death, and said, it's crazy, but I'm happy. So that was our David, poet, philosopher, lover, a lucky, happy man. And he would have been even happier today, because the last thing he really wanted to accomplish in this life was to get his poetry manuscript published. Another thing that happened on the last day of him being conscious was that we were able to read him a message that his fellow poet, Don Colburn, and his great teacher, Martha Rhodes, were determined to get the manuscript published. He wasn't able to respond to this good news at length, but he said one word, wow, and gave a thumbs up. The great news today is that Martha Rhodes, who's here today, owner of the respected Pulitzer-winning Four-Way Press, has decided to publish David's book. That would have made our happy man even happier. So, finally, I want to tell you something about the next speaker, Rupert Holmes, and how important he was to David in the last month of his life. David and Rupert were high school friends and classmates. In July, David sent Rupert a copy of the manuscript to read, his poetry manuscript, and what Rupert did with it was an extraordinary act of friendship. He decided to respond to each poem in the manuscript, starting with the first, one every day. He committed himself, unknown to us at the time, to write a response every day by early evening his time, so that our David would be able to read it that day. David loved reading these emails. They were often very long, very beautifully articulated appreciations of the poem at hand. Rupert pulled in strands from our shared past growing up in Nyack. With great empathy, he incorporated his understanding and knowledge of David's personal history to help explicate the poems, and he focused on the imagery, tone, and multiple meanings of each poem lovingly. As David would read these to me, he'd stop and comment how completely understood he felt, how Rupert was finding things in the poems that David himself had not been completely aware of, but immediately felt were deeply true. He would laugh his adorable little laugh of recognition and pleasure when Rupert got him. Once David could no longer read these himself, I read them to him. And that night, the one I referred to before, we sat up at 2:30 in the morning and I read him the last of these responses that he'd ever hear. That's it. David's last month was profoundly improved by Rupert's act of love.
I should clear up some confusion because I've been introducing myself to people as David Goldstein, and Bonnie's kind enough to honor the fact that my legal and pen name for 50 years has been Rupert Holmes. But whenever I'm in Nyack, and whenever I talk to David, whenever I talk to Bonnie, I'm David. When I was 18 and I broke into the record business, in those days, if your name was Bob Zimmerman, you changed it to Bob Dylan. If it was Carol Klein, you changed it to Carol King. If it was Ross Bagdasarian, you changed it to David Seville. And when I met my first publisher, he said, "David Goldstein, nice to meet you. What's your name?" So that sort of is a short explanation. So it turns out that David Corcoran was not the finest guy I ever knew in high school. Turns out that David Corcoran was the finest guy I ever knew. Case in point, this room. The last time I was standing here, just down the hill from David's last Nyack home, the intersection of Depew and Crosby, a few blocks away from the public library that David's mother oversaw so successfully. The last time I was standing here was at a memorial for my father, Leonard Goldstein, who was a Nyack public school music instructor and a Nyack boy, just as our David truly was and always will be. David never studied music with my father. In high school, I learned how to play the clarinet, and David learned absolutely everything else. And at the time of that memorial, sure, I was an old high school chum, but by no means David's best friend. And yet, as I looked around this room to speak about my dad, of course, there was David, sitting there, listening attentively. And David didn't live in Nyack at the time. I hadn't even asked him to come. But he cared about the past, cared about other people's pasts. He stayed for the reception, sat with my cousin Judy, managed to find her more interesting than I sure ever had, and then drove home in the dark to New Jersey. And if this memorial today were for one of us, and there was any possible way he could make it to our hometown, as you've so graciously come here today, you know he'd be there listening with that expression of compassion and resolute optimism which he never lost even to the last day of his life. I must confess that having to follow Bonnie's eloquent and loving portrait of David, as well as having to follow David's own stunning, courageous words, following that gives me the same feeling in my stomach as when I heard Merv Griffin say, "Well, we'd love to talk more with Orson Welles, but now let's meet Rupert Holmes." I'll try. Because so many of you met him as an adult, and because David has come back to Nyack this one last time. And may I share with you a little about his early years in this village that he so deeply cherished. As best I can learn, his first home was off the River Road in Piermont, the next town south of here, in the Schweiger bungalow directly behind the Schlachter house. That's how the Journal News put it in 1949, as if we should all know where that was. And maybe people did. Tragically, the reason the Journal News was informing us of where David, his mother, and his father John lived was because they were reporting what John told you about. terrible accident at the age of 30 while driving alone on Route 9W. David, who was not yet 2 years old, and his expectant mother, Ruth, were visiting relatives in Des Moines, Iowa at the time. Remember Iowa, it comes up again. I'd like to just say something about John Corcoran, and he was a highly creative photographer and writer for Science Illustrated at the time. And David's brother John, who created the highly regarded memorial sculpture for journalist Daniel Pearl, said of his father's tragic end, "My whole life came out of that. Who I am came out of that." Late in our friendship, I came to realize through his poetry that this was equally true of David. And there's yet another poem that David wrote called Later That Night, which continues to follow his father to how he must have been picked up by the car, must have been pulled off his body, taken to Nyack Hospital. It's painful, it's brave, and it's beautiful. Over the last 2 decades, David and I often took great pleasure discussing the vanishing landmarks of Rockland County, and particularly Nyack. We were particularly sad about the closing of Hilltop House, home of Lobster Delafano. We pondered what Lobster Delafano could have been. It's not a venue anywhere else. And while we were reminiscing about Nyack's beautiful old movie picture house, which was a vaudeville house in my father's time, the Rockland Theater, the Scores Rockland Theater, he mentioned that as an 8-year-old boy, he'd been strangely mesmerized by a 1955 feature entitled A Man Called Peter. He described sitting alone in that dark theater, watching it again and again for its entire run. I made a point of finding the movie. It was a slow-going account of a Scottish minister who became chaplain of the U.S. Congress. Not Godzilla, not War of the Worlds for an 8-year-old boy to watch. But in the last reel, the title character dies unexpectedly of a heart attack late one night, and we see his wife and lone son, played by an actor about the same age as David was then, looking devastated at the funeral. I asked David, did it not occur to you that you were seeing yourself on that screen, envisioning the night when your family was instantly reduced to just you and your expectant mother? So I suspect from his earliest years, David grew up pondering about and yearning for what might have been, which is, at least in part, why he revered all of our yesterdays. He valued the components of life as if each were a treasured family heirloom. You all know that he savored everything. It's not surprising he was such a great restaurant critic for the New Jersey edition of the New York Times. His ability to parse flavors and replicate them in words resembled that of a master chemist. 3 years after John Corcoran's death, as you've heard, Ruth married William DIEBOLD. They moved to the now idyllic North Broadway, and along the continuing boulevard of South Broadway, which still looks to me like a background painting from The Lady and the Tramp. With its Second Empire mansard roofs and gingerbread trim, his mother convinced the rustic stone and ivy Nyack Library to join the 20th century. But with all this sadness we're talking about, don't get the impression for a second that David was some kind of moody, melancholy Dane in school. Just the opposite. When I picture that young man, I see his kindliness, his openness to others and to new ideas, his friendly greetings, and the chipper bounce to his step, as if every moment held the promise of something delightful and fascinating. I see him laughing, but rarely at anyone else's expense. His keen interest in most everything under the sun helped to counterbalance his underlying shyness. Yes, he was valedictorian, but he was valedictorian in a graduating class where any of the top 10 students might easily have been valedictorian at any other high school in the state. And he wasn't simply book smart. Yes, he knew his facts. If they're given prizes for who doesn't cry today, I'm going home empty-handed. Yes, he knew his facts, but unlike so many of us at that age, he sought to understand what they meant, their context and implications. Getting a 92 on a test would sometimes prompt David to have a quiet understanding word with the teacher over the teacher's grading error. And invariably, the mistake would be corrected in David's favor. He was voted Male Senior of the Year without once being mistaken for a jock or a prom king. And he was universally appreciated across the seething snake pit of cliques and clans that high schools invariably become. David's comments in class held my interest in those days as if I were surreptitiously listening to the radio after midnight and he was Gene Shepherd. His voice was a man's voice, but that of a very genteel man. He chose his words judiciously. I'm talking about him in high school now, understand? He chose his words judiciously because words mattered to him. And when a teacher asked him a question, it was fascinating to hear him piece together an answer from various localities in his brain, as if he were assembling a plate at a gourmet antipasto table. Please explain to me how he could be so smart and also be so human, gentle, gracious, patient. Why do so many of us in this room feel we each had a private connection with David that few others had? And I suppose we all did sort of have that because of his sensitive, receptive nature. Among the loveliest things that was ever said of Charles Dickens was that he would allow no man to be a bore. And David tried never to allow another person to feel that the life they were leading was not interesting and important. Perhaps there are some things I can share with you about David that you don't know. He could create the scent of things in his head. If he wanted to smell a hot dog with brown mustard, it would take him about 5 seconds, but he could do so. And he still possessed that unusual gift before he died. Or maybe he was making the whole thing up all along. but I know he wasn't. In his senior year, he spontaneously performed for me, from memory, a flawless rendition of broadcaster Russ Hodges' famous "The Giants Win the Pennant! The Giants Win the Pennant!" It was a broadcast from 1951. It was endearing to me that our valedictorian would have taken the time amid all of his studies to commit to memory a TV commentator's play-by-play from 14 years earlier. But then again, he could also recite Casey and the Bat in full. I should mention that David was quite a fine actor in his teens. I noted this when he played the lead in an 8th grade farce called The Mishmash Bird. James Garland played a birdseed salesman, and in an interview with the Journal News, James Garland said it was his favorite role to date. David also played the male lead in the first play I ever wrote, back in my senior year. It was David, it was Janet Setzer, Sarah Stein, and Richard Hammond. But really his finest hour as a thespian was playing the title role in the Senior Drama Club's rendition of James Barrie's The Admirable Crichton, who was Crichton. I knew the play, and when I watched the performance they gave, I remember being surprised. I saw from the program that the faculty director, Richard Fisher, had cut the final act, which meant it fell upon David, sans dialogue, to help the audience intuit the ending of the play. And somehow, with a look of utter longing and an outreaching of his arms toward the parlor-maid Tweenie, played by David's lifelong friend, Mimi Leahy, he and she were able to nuance a satisfying ending as resourcefully as Crichton himself. His journalism career began here, not only as editor of the high school student paper, but as a stringer, and then staff writer for Rockland County's Journal News, getting byline credits as Journal News sports writer in his senior year. The Journal News was a completely legitimate professional newspaper. This was not a penny saver. His columns from that time aren't those of a kid. They read like a salty, seasoned pro in his 30s or 40s. And by the way, in my search through the Journal News archives, I found an article he wrote during the summer after his first year of college that focused on 3 wonderful Nyack High students trying to rally support for Biafra, one of whom was an articulate and committed young woman named Bonnie Stetson. Now that's what I call foreshadowing. He loved working at the record, Bergen Record, and the Time, and as sad as he was to leave the record, he reveled in flattery. I remember one day he visited me in a rehearsal studio on 43rd Street and looked out the 8th floor window across the street and said, "Yup, there's the old gray lady." I didn't think anyone actually said things like that. But he spoke it like a sailor revisiting the battleship on which he served and which brought him safely home. It was the last day of high school. Slow, lazy day. The teachers have nothing left to say. You erase the pencil marks from your books and talk amongst yourselves. I started talking with David, knowing I might never see him again. We talked baseball. We talked Robert Benchley versus James Thurber. I was a Benchley guy. He loved Benchley, but Thurber, I think, was his guy. Classical music, jazz, Bobby Kennedy, this new Bob Dylan thing. And at the end of our conversation, I looked at him and I said, "Gee, I feel like I've just been talking with the best friend I was always supposed to have." And in the last months of his life, I tried to be the kind of friend I wished I'd been in high school. After I said that to him, David shared a dark, whimsical secret with me. The moment he confided it, he looked as if he instantly regretted having told me. "You can't tell anyone, ever," he said to me. And I solemnly promised never to divulge it, a promise I kept to this day. But after his death, I was reading just some beautiful, poignant words written about him online by his dear classmate, Janet Setzer-Broughton. When she revealed the secret, I thought David had entrusted entirely to me. 55 years I've sealed my lips, and Janet gets to spill the beans. So, disenthralled from my responsibility, I feel free to share the secret with you now. And by the way, while we're at it, Rosebud is a sled. Okay, so one of David's assignments for the Journal News was to report the box scores for Little League games, which was tedious work. So our David made the assignments more interesting by reporting games played by non-existent teams with some unusually named players winning some damn exciting victories. So I checked the Journal News archives. Do I really think that in the spring of '65, a little leaguer named Marcel Proust pitched a shutout for West Nyack? Or that Bones McBiff hit 2 grand slams in the 9th inning to win a game? I supposed it was probable. But then I had my Rosetta Stone moment. In Janet's tender tribute, she reminded me that back then, David was very fond of the word wombat. It was his favorite friendly insult. And Sherlock Holmes, though I am, I thought to myself, David? And I did a search for the word wombat in the sports section. And I discovered he was inventing things in the bowling league as well. Is Mimi Leahy here? Is she? Where is she? Hi, Mimi. He got you a headline. He didn't just hide your name in there, he got you a headline. The story said that team member Bill Faulkner, you know, Faulkner who wrote The Sound of the Fury and As I Lay Bowling, scored 606 while Eudora Welty. Interesting how many novelists of the Deep South belong to the Nanuet Bowling League. Struck .498, but the Deadwoods lost 3-1 to the Rivieras when Mimi Leahy, who was tweenie in the admirable Crichton, rolled a women's high for the winners. The Iowans, one of his teams, the Iowans, swept the second-placed Winged Wombats and increased their, hardly surprisingly, to 22 undefeated games when Bill Crichton scored 588. And what I love here is that Mimi Leahy made it to the headlines of the bowling section alongside the real achievement of Lou Bianco, a real player. So either David had incredible chutzpah, or whoever wrote the leads for the paper became David's unwitting accomplice. This was actually not a good thing. for a professional journalist. And so I say to you, what you probably never expected to hear said today, let it be known throughout the land that David Corcoran invented fake news. In closing, let me go back for a moment to David's memorization of a long speech about the Dodgers winning the pennant. The Dodgers win the pennant. Since in 1965, when he performed that for me, there were no video recorders or DVDs. I asked him a few months ago if he'd learned the speech off some kind of, I don't know, great moments in sports record album. He confirmed that he had, and he emailed me another favorite highlight of his on that disc that he also committed to memory. It was Lou Gehrig's legendary farewell speech to Yankee Stadium. And David, with great wit, typed the words so that when you read them, you could hear them sort of over a stadium's echoey PA system. And the quote was, "I may have had a bad break, but today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." I've seen a newsreel clip many a time of Lou Gehrig and Gary Cooper reenacting it in Pride of the Yankees, and every time I ever saw that, I always wondered, how could someone who got such a raw deal, diagnosed with lateral sclerosis in their prime, ever say he felt lucky? But in some way, David embraced that same outlook. He wrote to me several times that no matter what I'd been hearing or what his doctors or blood tests were saying, he was fine, just fine. And although he never wanted this last year of his life to be what it was, and deeply wished and deserved to enjoy his new life and home with his body, I believe in some ways he was sincere when he said he was fine, just fine. A man who ran a casino where I once worked told me that the secret to beating the house wasn't knowing how much you were willing to lose. It was knowing what you were prepared to win. Knowing what it would take for you to say, hey, I've done pretty well. I'll thank my good fortune and say a grateful good night. As Bonnie and David expressed in much different words today, I think David felt he'd gotten a pretty good deal over the years. He'd found the absolute love of his life, and knew with certainty that he would live fully in her love after he was gone. And there was one part of that Lou Gehrig speech that David didn't quote in his email to me, but which I'm sure David knew quite well and would apply to Bonnie. When you have a wife who has been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, that's the finest I know. And David had come to learn this last year that the people for whom he cared deeply all cared deeply for him and were devastated by his ordeal. In a world of like-me-on-Facebook friends, he was respected and treasured by an amazing cast of characters, which includes all of you here today, whose ideas and personalities he deeply admired. From high school stringer for the Journal News, to editor of the editorial section of the Bergen Record, to science editor of the New York Times, to editor of a landmark hardcover volume about the history of science in the Times. That's some story. His career was distinguished, and rarely was it hard labor, because deep thinking, adroit language, dry humor, and the warm regard of his peers were among his greatest joys. And creatively, despite his innate modesty and tendency to speak more about his mentors than of himself, I feel he was starting to accept that he was writing the kind of poetry he himself would love to read, and that he'd acquired the ability to speak lyrically and fluently, like a masterful medium at a seance, for all the yearnings, sadness, merriment, and familial spirits that had floated around his mind since childhood and now reside between the lines of his poetry. None of this makes David's death okay. Nor does it mean it's acceptable that he was deprived of the years he planned to have with his Bonnie in New Mexico, or that his beloved family are not grief-stricken by their loss. But if you miss David, there is one small bit of good news. You can find him anew in his haunting and humane poems. And when you read these remarkable poems, you will learn things about him you never knew, no matter how well you thought you knew. You'll be able to laugh with him again. You can introduce him to your dearest friends. And once you do that, it will be very hard for you to think that he isn't here with you and here for you still. So as David might sign off, cheerio, you wonderful wombats.